The Arizona Territory, 1873. Dust and blood were old companions to Sŭ'ą, the Apache warrior known as Silent Arrow. His name was whispered with fear across the mesas, for he moved like death itself, swift, merciless, and without remorse. 27 notches marked his rifle, each a settler who had trespassed on sacred land. His face, weathered by sun and battle, betrayed no emotion. His heart sealed behind scars both seen and unseen. Then came the day he found her Miriam Abernathy, survivor of his own raid. Kneeling beside a dying stream, her sightless eyes turned skyward, unafraid despite the approaching footsteps. Could a woman who saw with her heart pierce the armor of a man who had forgotten his own? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the sandstone cliffs blood red as Sŭ'ã knelt beside the small fire. With practiced hands, he opened the worn leather pouch that contained his war paint ochre, charcoal, and sacred white clay gathered from the canyons where the old ones had painted their stories on stone. He mixed the ochre with bare fat, warming it between his palms before drawing 3 precise lines across his cheekbones. The ritual was as familiar to him as breathing. 20 summers had passed since soldiers had put his village to flame. He had been but a boy then, hiding in the brush as they took his mother, his sisters. The screams had long ago faded from his dreams, replaced by a cold, implacable purpose. The old man Nakins had found him afterward half-starved, mute with grief, and had shaped him into a weapon. "You must become like the arrow," Nakins had told him, "silent until the moment of impact. Your enemies will never hear you coming." Sŭ'ã applied the white clay in a handprint over his heart, the mark of a ghost warrior, one who had died and returned to walk between worlds. The settlers believed him to be a spirit, and he had cultivated the legend. Better to be feared than hunted. He rose and surveyed the valley below. The rising sun illuminated the distant dust cloud of wagons, white settlers, pushing ever deeper into Apache lands. They came with their black-robed priests, their diseases, their strange notions of owning the earth. This group had ventured far off the established trails, following rumors of gold in the western mountains. They would not reach their destination. Sŭ'ã checked his rifle, a Winchester model 1866, taken from a cavalry officer whose throat he had opened 3 summers past. 27 notches marked its stock, each a life he had taken in defense of his people's territory. He ran his thumb along the smooth indentations, a tally of justice. The Apache bands had splintered in recent years. Some had surrendered to the reservation, eating the white man's flour and dying slowly of despair. Others fought in scattered groups, raiding and retreating into the mountains. Sŭ'ã rode alone now, having broken with his chief over matters of strategy. The chief counseled caution. Sŭ'ã believed only in the language of blood. He mounted his painted stallion, a raid prize from Mexican rancheros to the south. The horse knew to move silently, to respond to the lightest touch of knee or heel. Together they were a single hunting entity, blending into the landscape like wind through grass. As he rode, memories of Nakins surfaced unbidden. The old warrior had taught him more than just killing. He had shown him the old ways, the songs that called rain, the plants that healed, the stars that guided. But it was the art of death that Sŭ'ã had embraced most fully. A warrior's heart must be like stone, Nakins had said, placing a river-smooth rock in the boy's palm. The water of emotion flows around it, but cannot penetrate. Sŭ'ã had learned the lesson well. When Nakins himself fell to a settler's bullet, Sŭ'ã had burned his body with dry eyes, feeling nothing but the weight of the river stone now hanging from a thong around his neck. From the ridge, he studied the wagon train's approach. 10 wagons, perhaps 40 settlers including women and children. 4 men on horseback, scouts or guards. Poor choices for entering Apache territory. The canyon ahead narrowed, with high walls of striated rock offering perfect positions for ambush. He would not need his small band of warriors for this. The terrain itself was his ally. And he had set the trap days ago fallen trees, strategically placed to funnel the wagons exactly where he wanted them. By sundown, the vultures would feast. Sŭ'ã touched the stone at his throat, a ritual before battle. His face revealed nothing, not anticipation, not hatred, not the hollow emptiness that sometimes threatened to consume him in the deep watches of night. He was simply a force of nature now, like the lightning that strikes without malice or mercy. Settlers had a name for him, whispered around campfires from Tucson to Santa Fe, the Ghost Walker. They feared him more than other Apache warriors, because he left no survivors to speak of his methods. Only silence in his wake. Sŭ'ã notched an arrow and waited. The stone heart within his chest beat steadily, unmoved by the knowledge that soon children would cry, women would plead, men would die cursing his name. This was the way of war. This was justice for a people being slowly exterminated. He watched the wagons approach the canyon, white canvas billowing like clouds against the red earth. His arrow pointed at the lead wagon's driver, a bearded man in a broad-brimmed hat, the man who had led his people into death. Sŭ'ã drew back the bowstring, his breathing calm and measured. The stone heart beat on. Miriam Abernathy sat on the wagon bench beside her father, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings on her mother's music box. The small wooden treasure was one of the few possessions she had insisted on bringing when they left Boston. When she opened it, the delicate melody transported her to another time, before the fever that took her sight, before her mother's passing, before this journey west that her father called God's new purpose. "Describe the landscape to me, Father," she said, closing the music box and tucking it carefully into her apron pocket. Reverend Thomas Abernathy smiled down at his daughter, though she couldn't see it. At 23, Miriam's face had a serene beauty that reminded him painfully of his late wife. Her unseeing eyes, pale blue like morning glories, seemed to look beyond the physical world. "We're passing through a valley, my dear. Red cliffs rise on either side, streaked with orange and yellow. Scrubby juniper trees cling to the rocks. The sky is so blue, it hurts the eyes to look at it, not a cloud to be seen. There's a bird of prey circling high above, an eagle, perhaps, or a hawk." Miriam tilted her head, listening. "I hear water somewhere." "A stream?" The Reverend chuckled. "You and your ears." "Yes, there's a stream ahead, though it looks nearly dry. Wagons will stop there to water the animals." Behind them, the Johnsons' children were singing a hymn, their young voices rising above the creak of wagon wheels and the steady plodding of oxen. 8 families had joined their wagon train in Santa Fe, all seeking new beginnings in California. Thomas had been persuaded to serve as their spiritual guide, preaching from his worn Bible each evening around the campfire. "We're making good time today," called Chester Wilson, the wagon master, as he rode alongside their wagon. "Though I don't much like the look of this canyon. Too narrow for comfort." "You worry too much, Chester," Thomas replied. "The Lord watches over us." Miriam's fingers found the rough cotton of her father's sleeve. "Mr. Wilson is right to be cautious, Father. I've heard the men talking about Apache raids." Wilson's face darkened. "Smart girl. There have been attacks all through this territory. Army's been worse than useless chasing shadows. There's one warrior they call Silent Arrow, or some such, deadly as they come. All God's children, Mr. Wilson," Thomas gently admonished. "Even the Apache." Wilson spat into the dust. "Tell that to the Millers after what happened to their settlement." He tipped his hat to Miriam. "Forgive my manners, Miss Abernathy." He spurred his horse forward to check on the lead wagons. Miriam's fingers returned to the music box, a habit when she felt anxious. "Father, perhaps we should listen to Mr. Wilson's concerns." Thomas patted her hand. "Fear is the enemy of faith, my dear. We must trust in divine providence." A wagon hit a rut, jostling them both. Miriam steadied herself, her other senses compensating for her blindness. She could smell sage and dust, feel the dry heat on her skin, taste alkali on her lips, and something else, a tension in the air like before a thunderstorm. "Father," she said quietly, "something doesn't feel right." Thomas sighed. His daughter's intuition had proven uncanny since the loss of her sight. What is it you sense? Eyes. Watching. Many eyes. That evening, as the wagon train circled near the shrinking stream, Miriam sat apart from the others, her sensitive fingers reading her father's Bible by touch. The raised dots of her special Gospel of John, a parting gift from her Boston church, moved beneath her fingertips, like tiny stars guiding her through darkness. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it, she read aloud, finding comfort in the familiar words. Nearby, the scout Jenkins was reporting to Wilson. Miriam's acute hearing picked up their hushed conversation. Tracks. Everywhere. Apache for certain. Recent too. Wilson cursed softly. How many? Can't say. Could be a small band. Could be more. Found this caught on a juniper branch. A pause. Eagle feather with red markings. War party. We should turn back. Jenkins continued. Head for the fort at Tucson. 3 days' journey at least, Wilson replied. Low on water already. Canyons half a day. Once we're through, it's open country to Silver Springs. Your funeral, the scout muttered. And everyone else's. Miriam closed her Bible and made her way carefully to where the men stood. Mr. Wilson, she said, I couldn't help overhearing. Please consider Mr. Jenkins' advice. Wilson started, not having heard her approach. Miss Abernathy, this isn't because I cannot see. I've learned to trust my other senses, she interrupted gently. And every instinct tells me there's danger ahead. Wilson's voice softened. I appreciate your concern, miss. But we can't turn back on a feeling. The people are tired. The oxen, too. We push through at first light. Double the watch tonight. That's all we can do. Later, as Miriam lay in the wagon listening to her father's soft snoring, she opened her music box one last time. The melody seemed discordant now, warning rather than soothing. She closed it and held it against her heart. Watch over us tomorrow, she whispered to the night. All of us. In the darkness beyond the wagons, silent figures moved like shadows. Against shadows, positioning themselves for the morning to come. First light bled across the eastern sky as the wagon train began to move. Sue watched from his position high on the canyon wall, his body perfectly still against the red rock. 3 warriors waited with him, while others were positioned at strategic points throughout the narrow passage. They had blocked the far end of the canyon during the night, dragging fallen trees across the path a barrier that would force the settlers to stop, to turn, to become confused in the moment before death fell upon them. Sue raised his hand, signaling patience to the young warrior beside him, who fingered his bow nervously. Nakian's voice echoed in his memory. The difference between a hunter and prey is not strength, but patience. The wagons entered the canyon in single file, canvas covers glowing amber in the early sun. Sue counted them 10 in all, just as he had observed the previous day. His eyes narrowed as he spotted the riders flanking the caravan, rifles. Across their saddles, 4 men, as expected. The settlers had grown complacent overnight, believing they had passed safely through danger. He waited until the last wagon had entered the narrowest part of the canyon, where the walls rose sheer on either side. Then he lifted his rifle and fired a single shot into the sky. The sound echoed like thunder between the stone walls. For one frozen moment, the wagon train continued forward, uncomprehending, and chaos erupted. Arrows rained down from both sides of the canyon. The lead wagon's driver fell, clutching his chest. Oxen bellowed in panic, trying to turn in the narrow space. Men shouted, women screamed, children cried out for their parents. Sue moved along the ridge with the fluid grace of a hunting cat, firing with deadly precision. One of the mounted guards spotted him and raised his rifle, but Sue's bullet found him first. The man toppled from his horse, his shot going wild. Below, the wagons had bunched together, creating a tangle of animals, vehicles, and terrified people. Some of the settlers had taken cover beneath the wagons and were returning fire, but they were shooting blindly. Unsure where the attack was coming from, Sue caught sight of a bearded man helping people from one of the wagons, same one who had sat beside the blind woman the previous day. He took aim, but something made him hesitate. The man was pulling children to safety, not fighting. Sŭ'ą shifted his aim to a younger man who was firing a pistol toward the canyon walls and squeezed the trigger. One less threat. The battle was swift and brutal. Within minutes, most of the adult men were dead or wounded. Sŭ'ą dealt to his warriors to move in and claim the spoils: rifles, ammunition, tools, food. These would help their people survive the coming winter. As he descended into the canyon, stepping carefully among the bodies, he saw the bearded man again. The preacher was crouched beside a wagon, shielding someone with his body. Sŭ'ã approached, silently, rifle ready. The man looked up, his eyes meeting Sŭ'ã's without fear. "God forgive you," he said quietly. Sŭ'ã did not understand the words, but he recognized the calm dignity in the man's face. For a heartbeat, he considered sparing him, and a shot rang out from behind another wagon. One of Sŭ'ã's warriors cried out in pain. The moment of hesitation vanished, replaced by cold purpose. Sŭ'ã raised his rifle and fired. The preacher collapsed without a sound. As he fell, Sŭ'ã caught a glimpse of who he had been protecting. The blind woman pressed against the wagon wheel, her face a mask of terror as she reached out, trying to find her father. "Thomas," she called, her voice breaking. "Father?" Sŭ'ã stepped back, suddenly uncomfortable. Killing armed men was one thing. This woman was helpless, unseeing. There was no honor in such a kill. One of his warriors approached, gesturing toward her with his knife. Sŭ'ã shook his head sharply and made a sign to leave her. The warrior looked confused, but obeyed. Moving on to search another wagon, Sŭ'ã watched as the woman found her father's body, her hands moving over his face, her shoulders beginning to shake with silent sobs. Something twisted inside him, not quite regret, but a shadow of it. He turned away. The raid was over quickly. The surviving settlers, mostly women and children, huddled together in terror as the Apache warriors took what they needed from the wagons: guns, ammunition, tools, food, blankets. One wagon wheel lay shattered from an ox team's panic. Wooden spokes splintered like broken bones. Sŭ'ã called to his men in their language. "Enough. Take what you have gathered and go north to the meeting place. I will follow." The youngest warrior protested, pointing to the survivors. "What of them?" Sŭ'ã's face hardened. "The desert will decide their fate. We have what we came for." As his men departed with their spoils, Sŭ'ã surveyed the aftermath of the ambush. The blind woman still knelt beside her father's body, now rocking back and forth, a small wooden box clutched in her hands. The other survivors watched Sŭ'ã with terrified eyes, expecting execution. Instead, he turned and walked away, following his warriors into the rocks. He told himself he was being merciful, though he knew the desert would likely kill the survivors. As surely as a bullet. A slower death, perhaps, but the result would be the same. Yet as he climbed back to his horse, Sŭ'ã found himself looking back at the devastation below, at the blind woman's solitary figure among the dead and dying. For the first time in many years, the stone heart felt heavy in his chest. The sun climbed higher, baking the canyon in merciless heat. Miriam remained beside her father's body, long after the other survivors had gathered their wounded and moved toward the stream. Her world, already dark, had collapsed into a void of grief and disbelief. Her fingers traced the familiar contours of her father's face one last time, the bristly beard, the gentle brow, the lips now stilled forever. "I won't leave you here alone," she whispered, though she knew his spirit had already departed. From nearby came Mrs. Johnson's voice, tight with controlled panic. "Miriam, dear, we must move before they return." "They won't return," Miriam said with strange certainty. "They've taken what they wanted." Her hands found her father's chest, where his Bible would be in the inner pocket of his coat. The leather-bound book was still there, worn from his body. She carefully removed it, her fingers finding the family record pages at the front where births, marriages, and deaths had been recorded for 3 generations of Abernathys. Later, she thought, later she would add his name to that solemn list. Survivors, 3 women, 4 children, and 1 badly wounded man gathered what supplies remained and began their stumbling retreat from the canyon. Mrs. Johnson tried to guide Miriam, but she pulled away. "I know you mean well," Miriam said gently, "but I need a moment alone to say goodbye. We can't wait, child. The little ones need water, and Mr. Barton won't last without proper care." Miriam nodded. "Go ahead to the stream. I'll follow the sound of the water. I won't be long." After they left, Miriam knelt beside her father one last time. No tears came. The shock was still too great. Instead, she prayed, her voice barely a whisper in the silent canyon. "Lord, receive the soul of Thomas Abernathy, your faithful servant. Guide him home." Her voice broke. "And guide me now that I walk alone." She placed her mother's music box on her father's chest. Some sacrifices were necessary. The box would be too heavy to carry along with the Bible and what little food she could gather. Better that this treasured piece of her past remain with him than be abandoned on the trail when her strength failed. With careful movements, Miriam collected dirt and small stones, covering her father's face and chest in a makeshift burial. It was woefully inadequate, but she could do no more. "Goodbye, father," she whispered, rising unsteadily to her feet. Using her acute hearing, Miriam followed the faint sound of running water. Her walking stick had been lost in the chaos, so she moved with arms outstretched, stumbling occasionally on the rough ground. The voices of the other survivors grew more distinct as she approached the stream. Then came a sound that stopped her cold weeping, followed by Mrs. Johnson's voice. "They've gone ahead without us. God help them. They've taken the remaining wagon." Miriam's heart sank. The Wilsons and Bartons had abandoned them, taking the last functioning wagon and supplies. With Mr. Barton wounded, they must have decided their chances were better if they traveled faster, unburdened by a blind woman and children. She continued forward until the sound of water was directly before her. Kneeling, she dipped her hands into the stream, surprised at how shallow it was, barely enough to wet her palms. "It's nearly dry," Mrs. Johnson confirmed, hearing her approach. "Hardly enough for the children, let alone to fill canteens for a journey." Miriam felt the presence of the others around her. Mrs. Johnson, her 2 small children, Mrs. Cooper and her infant daughter, all looking to her now. She realized, her father gone and the others fled, she was the closest thing to an authority figure remaining. "We'll rest here until evening," she decided, "then follow the stream bed. Water flows downhill. It must lead somewhere." As the day progressed, Miriam's shock began to fade, replaced by a dull, throbbing grief, and beneath it, a steely determination. Her father had raised her to believe that God never abandoned his children, even in their darkest hours. She clung to that faith now. By mid-afternoon, Mrs. Cooper's baby had developed a fever. The infant's cries grew weaker as the hours passed. Mrs. Johnson's youngest, only 4 years old, was also showing signs of heat sickness. Their situation was deteriorating rapidly. Miriam soaked her handkerchief in the trickle of water and pressed it to the baby's forehead. "We can't wait until evening," she said. "We need to find better water now." Using her father's walking stick, which Mrs. Johnson had retrieved for her, Miriam began to follow the nearly dry stream bed. The others followed, Mrs. Cooper carrying her whimpering infant, Mrs. Johnson helping her children along. The canyon walls eventually gave way to open desert. The stream bed continued, though water was now only occasionally visible in stagnant pools. The heat was oppressive, seeming to press down from above and radiate up from below simultaneously. Miriam's lips cracked from dehydration, but she refused. The sips of water the others offered from their dwindling supply. Her mind drifted to the Apache warrior who had killed her father yet spared her. She had not seen him, of course, but she had sensed his presence, had heard his breathing as he stood over her. There had been a moment when she thought he might kill her too, and in that moment she had almost welcomed it. Unbeknownst to Miriam, Sŭ'ą had doubled back after sending his warriors ahead with their spoils. Something had drawn him back to the canyon curiosity, perhaps, or some deeper impulse he didn't care to examine. From a distance, he had watched the survivors' pitiful exodus, tracking them as they followed the disappearing stream into the desert dot. Now he watched the blind woman leading the small group, her face set in concentration as she tapped her stick against the dry earth, following the water's ghost. There was courage there, he acknowledged reluctantly. A different kind than he was accustomed to, but courage nonetheless. He should leave them to their fate. It was the way of war, the natural consequence of defeat. Yet he found himself continuing to shadow their slow progress, telling himself he was merely ensuring they did not circle back toward his band's territory. By the third day, Miriam was alone. Mrs. Cooper's infant had succumbed to fever that first night. They had buried the tiny body beneath a solitary mesquite tree, Miriam reciting what prayer she could remember as Mrs. Cooper sobbed beside her. Before dawn, Mrs. Johnson had taken her children and Mrs. Cooper and turned back, determined to find the main trail and possible rescue. Miriam, knowing her blindness would slow them down, had chosen to continue following the stream. The water must lead somewhere, she had insisted. You go back, I'll go forward. Now she knelt beside a shallow depression in the earth, where the last moisture gathered in a puddle no larger than her cupped hands. The clay water vessel she had found abandoned in the attack, probably left by the Apache themselves, was nearly empty. Carefully, she poured its remaining contents into the ground. Show me where you come from, she whispered to the water. Show me your source. Miriam pressed her palms against the damp earth, feeling for any sign of seepage, any hint of underground flow. There a slight coolness to her left. She dug with her fingers, scraping away layers of sandy soil until moisture began to pool slowly in the small hole. She waited patiently, letting the water gather before carefully scooping it into her vessel. It wasn't much, but it would keep her alive another day. Her father had always said she had the patience of Job, a quality that had served her well since losing her sight. Thank you, Lord, for this sustenance, she murmured, taking a careful sip. The water was silty, but wet her parched throat. The sun beat down mercilessly. Miriam had fashioned a crude head covering from her petticoat, but still the heat pressed against her like a physical weight. Her fair skin had burned badly the first day. Now it was peeling, adding to her discomfort. She knew her chances were slim. Even with water, she had no food beyond a few pieces of jerky she'd rationed carefully. Her world had contracted to the next step, the next breath, the next heartbeat. Yet giving up was not in her nature. The light shines in the darkness, she recited, her voice barely audible, and the darkness has not overcome it. Miriam tilted her face skyward, feeling the sun's position. Still several hours of daylight left. She should continue while she had strength. Rising unsteadily, she gathered her few possessions, the water vessel, her father's Bible wrapped carefully in a clean handkerchief, and the walking stick, and began moving forward once more. From his position among the rocks 50 yards away, Sŭ'ą watched the blind woman with growing curiosity. The others had turned back 2 days ago, but she had continued alone, following the dry stream with uncanny accuracy. Twice she had found water where even he, with his desert knowledge, would have missed it. He should have left days ago to rejoin his band. They would be wondering at his absence, perhaps thinking he had fallen to a settler's bullet. Yet something about this woman's determination had kept him watching, following. She should have died by now. The desert killed the unwary quickly and without mercy. But she moved with a quiet purpose that seemed to defy the very elements. Sŭ'ã shifted position, dislodging a small stone that clattered down the rocky slope. He froze, but it was too late. Miriam's head turned sharply toward the sound. "Hello?" she called, her voice rough from thirst. "Is someone there?" Sŭ'ã remained motionless, barely breathing. Miriam took a tentative step toward the sound. "Please," she said. "I know someone's there. I can hear you breathing." Sŭ'ã considered his options. He could slip away, she was blind after all. Or he could kill her quickly, a mercy compared to slow death by thirst and exposure. Neither option satisfied him. Making his decision, he stepped forward, moving deliberately to make his footfalls audible. Miriam turned toward the sound, her posture tense but not fearful. "Who's there?" she asked. Sue stopped a few paces from her. He knew she couldn't see him, yet her cloudy blue eyes seemed to look directly at him, as if seeing through to his core. It was unsettling. "You're one of them, aren't you?" she said quietly. "One of the Apache who attacked our wagons." Sue said nothing, understanding her words, but having no way to respond in her language. Miriam's hands tightened on her walking stick, but she didn't back away. With slow, deliberate movements, she extended the water vessel toward him. "Water," she said, then repeated the word more slowly. "Water." Sue eyed at the offered vessel in confusion. Was this a trick? Why? Would she offer her precious water to one who had killed her people? Miriam took a small step forward, still holding out the vessel. "Please," she said, "take it." Cautiously, Sue reached for the vessel, his fingers briefly touching hers. She flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. He examined the crude pottery container, noting how little water remained. Looking back at her sunburned face and cracked lips, he understood the magnitude of her offering. Instead of drinking, he handed the vessel back to her, pressing it gently into her hands. A small smile touched Miriam's lips. "Thank you," she said. Something stirred within Sŭ'õ's chest, an unfamiliar sensation that he quickly suppressed. This woman was an enemy, a settler, part of the tide that threatened to wash away his people. And yet, a rumble of distant thunder interrupted his thoughts. Both of them turned toward the sound. The sky to the west was darkening, a summer storm approaching. Such storms could bring flash floods to the dry washes and canyons, death rushing down from the mountains in walls of water. Sue looked at the stream where Miriam stood, knowing it would become a death trap if the rains came hard. Without conscious thought, he reached out and took her arm. "Ah!" she gasped, startled by the contact. Sue tugged gently, trying to convey the need to move to higher ground. Miriam resisted for a moment, then seemed to understand. She nodded, allowing him to guide her away from the stream toward the rocky slopes. As the first fat raindrops began to fall, Sue led her toward a shallow cave he had noticed earlier, one of many such formations in these hills. It wasn't much, but it would provide shelter from both the coming storm and the merciless sun. Thunder cracked overhead, and the rain began to fall in earnest. Miriam's face turned upward, a smile of pure joy spreading across her features as the cool drops washed over her burned skin. In that moment, watching her embrace the rain like a blessing, Sue felt the stone heart within his chest shift ever so slightly. The cave was shallow but dry, its opening barely tall enough for Sue to enter without stooping. Outside, the desert storm unleashed its fiery sheets of rain, transforming the parched landscape. Lightning splitting the darkened sky, thunder echoing off canyon walls. Inside, an uncomfortable silence hung between the unlikely companions. Miriam sat with her back against the cool stone, knees drawn to her chest. Though she couldn't see her surroundings, her other senses painted the picture: the mineral smell of damp rock, the acoustics of the small space, the occasional drip from the low ceiling, and the presence of the warrior, his breathing controlled, but audible in the confined space. "Thank you," she said into the darkness, unsure if he understood. "For the shelter." Sue watched her curiously. In the dim light filtering through the cave entrance, her pale face seemed to glow against the shadows. Her hair, once neatly pinned, now hung in tangled strands around her shoulders. Her dress was torn and dirt-stained, yet she maintained a quiet dignity that puzzled him. The stone floor was cold. Without thinking, Sue unrolled the ceremonial blanket he carried tied to his belt, a tightly woven piece with intricate patterns representing the sacred mountains, thunderbirds, and the path of the warrior. It had been Nakain's final gift to him before death. He hesitated, then spread half of it toward Miriam, tapping her arm lightly to draw her attention. Miriam's hand moved cautiously, fingers finding the edge of the blanket. She explored its texture, tracing some of the raised patterns woven into the fabric. "It's beautiful," she said, though she couldn't see it. Her fingers continued their exploration, creating a map of the design in her mind. Sue watched, fascinated by how she saw with her hands. He had never considered how a blind person understood the world. Did she dream in darkness? Or did her dreams contain visions her waking mind could not experience? "My name is Miriam," she said suddenly, placing a hand on her chest. "Miriam." She gestured toward him expectantly. Sue understood. Names had power. To share one's name with an enemy was dangerous. Yet she was no warrior, and her blindness made her no threat to his people. After a moment's hesitation, he touched his own chest. "Sue," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. How long since he had introduced himself? The Apache knew him. The settlers feared him. Neither asked his name. "Sue," she repeated, the pronunciation surprisingly close. "Thank you, Sue." Something about hearing his name from her lips, not whispered in fear or spoken with hatred, stirred a long-forgotten memory. His mother, calling him in from play as evening shadows lengthened across their village. Before the soldiers came, before blood and fire remade him into someone else, pushing the memory away, Sue moved to the cave entrance, watching the rain transform the desert. Flash floods would be forming in the canyons. The dry-streamed Miriam had been following would now be a churning river of muddy water, carrying boulders and uprooted trees in its violent rush. Had he not guided her to higher ground, she would have been swept away. Why had he saved her? The question nagged at him. She was a settler, part of the encroachment that threatened his people's very existence. Her death would have been one less invader on Apache land. Yet here she sat, sheltered beneath Nakian's sacred blanket, speaking his name without fear. A particularly loud thunderclap shook the small cave. Miriam startled, drawing the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I've always feared storms," she admitted, speaking more to herself than to him. "Even before I lost my sight, the noise, the power of it." Sue turned to watch her. Though he couldn't understand her words, her tone conveyed vulnerability. Strange how this woman who had survived an attack, the desert, and the loss of her companions would fear the life-bringing rain. Miriam began to hum softly, perhaps to comfort herself against the storm's fury. The melody was simple, but haunting, a song unlike any Sue had heard before. It spoke of distant places, of a gentler world than the harsh one he knew. Without conscious decision, he moved back from the entrance and sat near her, close enough that she would sense his presence, but not so near as to alarm her. The blanket stretched between them, connecting them in the dimness. The humming stopped. "My mother sang that to me," Miriam said, "when I was frightened as a child. Before the fever took my sight." She paused. "And later, when darkness was all, I knew she would sing it still." Sue listened to the cadence of her voice, the rise and fall of unfamiliar words. Though he couldn't understand her language, something in her tone spoke directly to the carefully guarded place within him, the place where memories of his own mother resided, preserved like pressed flowers between the pages of his consciousness. This storm's intensity began to wane, the spaces between thunder growing longer. In the relative quiet, Sue found himself reaching for the small fire-making kit he carried. Soon, a tiny flame cast dancing shadows across the cave walls. Miriam turned toward the warmth, her face illuminated by the flickering light. "Fire," she said, extending her hands toward the heat. "Thank you." "Fire," Sue repeated in English, the word feeling strange on his tongue. Miriam's expression brightened at his use of her language. "Yes, fire," she confirmed, then pointed toward herself. "Miriam." "Miriam," he echoed. She gestured to the flames. "Fire," she said again, then spoke a word in what he assumed was her language for his people. "Kai," he corrected her, giving the Apache word. "K," she repeated carefully. And so, as the storm gradually subsided outside, a hesitant exchange began within the cave. Simple words passed back and forth like peace offerings, building the first fragile bridge between their worlds. Dawn broke clear and brilliant after the storm. The desert transformed. What had been parched earth now glistened with moisture, and the air carried the sweet scent of wet sage and creosote. Puddles caught the early light like scattered mirrors, and in the distance, temporary waterfalls cascaded down red rock faces, stood at the cave entrance, surveying the changed landscape. The path Miriam had been following was now a raging torrent of muddy water, confirming his decision to move her to higher ground. But the storm had also washed away any tracks he might have left. His band would have no way to find him, and he had been absent far longer than intended. Behind him, Miriam stirred, awakening from her exhausted sleep. She sat up, orienting herself by touch and sound. "Good morning," she said. Her voice, clearer after yesterday's rain, had quenched her thirst. "At least, I think it's morning. The air feels different." Sŭ'ã oozed as she carefully folded his ceremonial blanket, her fingers moving with reverence over the intricate patterns. She held it out toward where she had heard him moving. "Thank you," she said. He crossed to her and took the blanket, their fingers briefly touching in the exchange. Yesterday's rain had eased her immediate peril, but Sŭ'ã knew the desert would soon reclaim its harshness. The water would evaporate quickly under the relentless sun, leaving her in the same desperate situation. A decision formed in his mind. There was a place, a hidden spring, known only to the Apache, where water flowed year-round from deep within the earth. It was a sacred site, a place where his people performed ceremonies and vision quests. Taking a settler there violated everything he believed about protecting his people's secrets. And yet she was blind. She could not lead others to it. And she had offered him her last water without knowing who he was. "Come," he said in Apache, touching her arm to convey his meaning. Miriam startled slightly at the contact, but nodded her understanding. She gathered her few possessions, the clay water vessel, now refilled from yesterday's rain, and her father's Bible, carefully wrapped to protect it from moisture. Sŭ'ã led her from the cave, guiding her over the rough terrain with occasional touches to her elbow. He set a careful pace, not too fast for her to manage with her walking stick, yet urgent enough to reach their destination before the full heat of day descended. They traveled in silence for over an hour, climbing steadily into the foothills. Miriam stumbled occasionally, but never complained, her face set in concentration as she navigated by the sound of his footsteps and the guidance of his hand. As they rounded a rocky outcrop, Sŭ'ã paused. Before them lay a small canyon, invisible from below, its walls creating a natural fortress. At its center, surrounded by surprisingly lush vegetation, a clear pool reflected the morning sky. The spring bubbled up from beneath a rock formation shaped like a sleeping mountain lion, the water so pure it seemed to glow in the sunlight. Sŭ'ã guided Miriam carefully down the steep path to the canyon floor. As they approached the spring, he heard her sharp intake of breath. "Water," she said. "I can hear it and smell it too, so clean." He led her to the pool's edge and watched as she knelt, running her fingers through the cool, clear water before cupping some to her lips. Her expression of pure joy at the taste made something shift inside him, sensation both uncomfortable and strangely satisfying. "This is wonderful," she said after drinking deeply. "How did you know this was here?" Sŭ'ã couldn't answer in words she would understand, but he knelt beside her and took a handful of sand, letting it trickle between his fingers to make a soft shushing sound. "Secret?" Miriam guessed, seeming to understand his gesture. "This is your people's secret place?" He touched her hand briefly in affirmation. Miriam's expression grew solemn. "I understand. Thank you for trusting me with this." She turned her face toward the sun, feeling its warmth. "It feels peaceful here, sacred." Sŭ'ã watched her curiously. How could she sense the power of this place without seeing it? Yet somehow she had grasped its significance, responding with appropriate reverence. From his pouch, he withdrew an eagle feather one that had been given to him by Napiens upon completing his first successful hunt. It was a talisman of protection, imbued with the eagle's keen sight and wisdom. After a moment's hesitation, he pressed it into Miriam's hand. Her fingers explored the feather delicately, tracing its shape. "It's beautiful," she said, though she couldn't see it. "But I can't take something so valuable from you." Sŭ'ã closed her fingers around it, making a sound of insistence. She needed its protection more than he did. "Thank you," she said, carefully tucking the feather into her bodice. "I'll treasure it." They rested by the spring through the heat of midday, refilling the water vessel and soaking strips of fabric that Miriam tore from her petticoat to wrap around her blistered feet. Sŭ'ą gathered edible berries and roots that grew near the water, showing Miriam how to identify them by touch and smell. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Sŭ'ã considered their next steps. He had brought her to water, fulfilling an obligation he hadn't acknowledged until now. He should leave her here, where she had shelter and sustenance, and return to his people. They would be watching the trails for cavalry patrols coming to investigate the wagon train attack. His absence would be noted, questioned. He rose, preparing to explain through gestures that he must go. But before he could act, a distant sound froze him in place. The unmistakable report of a rifle followed. Another. Somewhere to the south, men were hunting. And in these lands, that could only mean one thing: settlers searching for survivors. For Miriam, it meant potential rescue. For Sŭ'ã, it meant mortal danger. Sŭ'ã's body tensed at the distant gunshots. Instinct honed by years of warfare assessed the situation in moments. At least 3 different rifles, likely cavalry rather than civilians, based on the rhythm of the shots. They were sweeping the area, probably following the stream bed where the wagons had been attacked. He turned to Miriam, who had also heard the shots, her head tilted in the direction of the sound. "People," she said, hope lighting her features. "Searching for survivors?" Her expression made something twist inside him. Of course she would want rescue, return to her kind. What future could she possibly have otherwise? Yet the thought of her leaving stirred an unfamiliar disquiet. Then came another sound that drove all other considerations from his mind, the clear, piercing note of a cavalry bugle carrying across the desert. The signal to converge. They had found something, perhaps bodies. Sŭ'ã moved swiftly, gathering their few possessions. There was no time for explanations. If the cavalry found this place, found him, there would be no mercy. They had been hunting him specifically for months. The infamous ghost walker who had claimed so many settler lives. He grasped Miriam's arm, pulling her to her feet with more force than he'd intended. "What?" she gasped, startled by his sudden urgency. "He hissed, the universal sound for silence. Another bugle call, closer now. Too close. "Soldiers," he managed in halting English, a word he knew from bitter experience. Then, "Kill. Me? Kill." He touched his chest, trying to convey the danger. Confusion crossed Miriam's face, followed by dawning comprehension. "The soldiers will kill you if they find you here," she translated, her voice dropping to a whisper. Sŭ'ã tugged gently on her arm, indicating they needed to move. Now Miriam hesitated, clearly torn. The soldiers represented safety, return to civilization, her own people. Yet the man beside her had saved her life, shown her kindness when he could have left her to die in the desert. "I should stay," she said, though she knew he wouldn't understand. "They'll take me back to—" The sharp crack of a rifle, much closer than before, cut off her words. Sŭ'ã tensed, scanning the canyon rim. Nothing visible yet, but they were approaching rapidly. "Go," Miriam said suddenly, pushing him away. "Save yourself. I'll be fine." But Sŭ'ã didn't move. The soldiers had undoubtedly tracked them to this area. If they found Miriam alone, they would question her about the Apache who had brought her here. She might not intend to betray him, but they had ways of extracting information. And once they knew of this place, his people's sacred spring would become yet another territory claimed by the white man. Decision made. He grasped Miriam firmly by the wrist and pulled her toward a narrow fissure in the canyon wall, a hidden exit known only to the Apache. Her initial resistance gave way as she sensed his determination. "You're taking me with you," she said, not a question but a realization. As they slipped into the narrow passage, the sounds of men's voices echoed from the canyon entrance. Sŭ'ã pressed Miriam against the cool rock wall, his body shielding hers, as a patrol of 6 cavalry soldiers appeared at the rim, surveying the spring below. Looks undisturbed, one called to another. No tracks recent enough to matter. Keep moving then, responded who appeared to be the leader. We're burning daylight. They watched as the soldiers watered their horses, filled their canteens, and continued their search, passing within 20 feet of where Sŭ'ą and Miriam hid in tense silence. Had it been only Sŭ'õ, he might have attempted to eliminate. Them 6 soldiers were not beyond his capabilities. But not with Miriam there. Not without risking her safety. Not only when the sounds of horses and men had faded did Sŭ'õ release his breath. Beside him, Miriam's face was pale, her breathing shallow. They're gone? She whispered. Sŭ'õ squeezed her hand once in affirmation. You could have let them take me, she said. Why didn't you? He had no words to explain, even in his own language. Instead, he gently urged her forward, deeper into the passage that would lead them away from the soldiers and toward the mountains that had been his sanctuary for so long. As they emerged on the other side of the ridge, Miriam stumbled on the uneven ground. Sŭ'å'd her before she could fall, his arm around her waist steadying her. For a moment they stood like that, connected, her hand gripping his forearm, her face turned up toward his, though she couldn't see him. I don't understand, she said softly. You're taking me deeper into Apache territory, aren't you? He released her, uncomfortable with the prolonged contact and the unfamiliar feelings it stirred. Touching her shoulder, he guided her forward, setting a pace she could manage with her walking stick. They needed to put distance between themselves and the patrol before nightfall. As they walked, Sŭ'õ found himself watching Miriam with growing curiosity. She had not called out to the soldiers, had not tried to escape him, even when the opportunity presented itself. Despite everything, the attack on her people, her father's death at his hands, the hardships of their journey, she had chosen to remain with him rather than seek rescue. Why? The question troubled him as they climbed higher into the rugged landscape. He called home. Shadows lengthened as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks. Soon they would need to find shelter for the night. The mountains grew cold after dark, and Miriam's thin dress would provide little protection against the chill. Ahead lay a decision he had never expected to make, whether to take this blind settler woman to his private dwelling, a place no white person had ever seen. The small cave he had established as his own after breaking with his band was not much, but it contained his few personal possessions, weapons, supplies. Taking her, there would be yet another breach of his own carefully maintained isolation. Yet what choice did he have? The soldiers would continue their search. The desert would show her no mercy, and something within him, some long-dormant instinct, rebelled at the thought of abandoning her now. The mountain dwelling was not what Miriam had expected, though what she had expected she couldn't have said. Perhaps a crude shelter of branches, or a smoky tipi like those described in her father's books about the Western Territories. Instead, Sŭ'õ had led her to what felt like a small but comfortable cave, its entrance concealed behind a stand of juniper trees. Steps, he warned in his limited English, guiding her hand to a series of stone ledges that led downward. Miriam descended carefully, counting to herself. 7 steps, worn smooth by passage. The air changed as they entered cooler, with an earthy scent mixed with something else. Herbs, perhaps, and the faint tongue of smoke. Sit, Sŭ'õ said, directing her to what felt like a low platform, covered with some sort of hide. She settled herself, grateful for the rest after their hurried journey. While Sŭ'õ moved about the space, Miriam extended her hands, exploring her surroundings through touch. The platform beneath her was sturdy, the hide covering soft with use. Nearby, her fingers encountered smooth stone, some sort of basin or bowl carved from rock. Sudden flame illuminated the space. She could sense its warmth and hear the soft crackle of burning tinder. By its light, Sŭ'õ studied her. Her fair skin was sunburned and peeling across her nose and cheeks, her once neat hair now a tangled mass, her dress torn and dirty. Yet she sat with a quiet dignity, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the sound of his movements. Better? He asked, one of the few English words he had grasped during their journey. "Yes," Miriam answered. "Thank you." She felt him move closer, then the cool touch of a damp cloth against her face. She flinched in surprise, but then held still as he gently wiped away the dust and grime of their journey. To her, he was simply Sŭ'ą, the man who had saved her in the desert. Was it possible, he wondered, to become the person she believed him to be? To be defined not by the blood on his hands, but by the humanity she so easily recognized in him? The thought was as unsettling as it was compelling, like the first glimpse of a trail leading into unknown territory. Dangerous, perhaps, but impossible to ignore now that it had been seen. "Hold it like this," Sŭ'ã said, guiding Miriam's hands as she wove the thin strips of yucca fiber into a simple rabbit snare. His English had improved remarkably over the weeks they had spent together, though he still spoke in fragments rather than full sentences. Miriam's nimble fingers followed his guidance, weaving the pattern with surprising dexterity. "Like this?" "Yes." "Good." He watched her work, impressed by how quickly she learned. The snare taking shape in her hands was nearly as well crafted as one. He might make himself. 2 weeks had passed since he had brought her to his mountain dwelling. The cavalry patrols had eventually abandoned their search, returning to the fort. To the south, with the immediate danger past, Sŭ'ã had found himself reluctant to broach the subject of Miriam's departure. Each day that passed deepened the unspoken question between them. What came next? Instead of confronting it directly, he had begun teaching her survival skills, how to identify edible plants by smell and touch, how to find water by listening for certain birds, and now how to set simple traps for small game. He told himself it was practical. If she ever found herself alone again, such knowledge might keep her alive. But beneath this rationalization lay a more complex truth. Teaching her these skills meant imagining a future where she might need them, a future apart from him. "Now show where to place," Miriam prompted, holding up the completed snare. Sŭ'ã led her outside the cave to a small clearing where rabbit tracks crisscrossed the dusty ground. He guided her hands to feel the narrow pathways worn in the earth by the animals' frequent passage. "Feel?" he asked. "This is Rabbit Road." Miriam smiled at his phrasing. "A rabbit trail," she corrected gently. "They come this way often?" "Yes, morning, evening, looking for food." Together they set the snare, Sŭ'ã showing her how to secure it and position the trigger mechanism so that a passing rabbit would disturb it. Miriam's face was a study in concentration, her fingers carefully memorizing each step of the process. "Will it kill the rabbit quickly?" she asked, a note of concern in her voice. Sŭ'ã considered how to explain. "Yes, fast, no suffering. Good." She nodded, satisfied. "I don't mind hunting for food, but I wouldn't want anything to suffer needlessly." As they worked, Sŭ'ã found himself watching her more than the task at hand. The past weeks had transformed her. The sunburn had faded, replaced by a light tan that suited her. Her hair, which she now braided simply down her back, had lightened from its original brown to a sun-streaked honey color. The torn dress had been replaced by a simple garment he had fashioned together from a soft deerskin, a project that had involved much laughter, as Miriam's first attempts at sewing without sight had produced rather crooked seams. But the most striking change was in her confidence. She moved through his dwelling and the surrounding area with increasing sureness, her blindness seeming less a disability than simply another way of experiencing the world. She had mapped the cave in her mind so thoroughly that she rarely bumped into anything now, and she could identify dozens of plants by their scent and texture. "What else should I learn?" she asked as they walked back toward the cave entrance. "What's most important for survival out here?" Sŭ'ã considered the question seriously. "Water first, always. Food next. Then shelter from sun, from cold, and protection from danger?" she prompted. He touched her arm lightly, a gesture that had become natural between them. "Yes. Listen always. Desert speaks. Tells of danger coming." Miriam nodded thoughtfully. "I've noticed my hearing has improved since being out here." There's so much to listen to when you really pay attention. The different birds, the insects, the way the wind sounds different through different types of plants. Sue eyed a sound of agreement. You hear good, better than many who see. The simple compliment brought a smile to her face. Thank you. I've had to rely on my ears since losing my sight. Later that evening, they returned to check the snare, and found it had been successful. A plump rabbit lay caught in the trap, its neck broken cleanly by the mechanism. Sue showed Miriam how to dress the animal, guiding her hands through the process of removing the skin and preparing the meat for cooking. If someone had told him months ago that he would be teaching a blind settler woman Apache hunting skills, he would have thought them mad. Yet here they were, working side by side in the fading light, their hands moving in a coordinated dance of shared purpose. As they cooked the rabbit over the small fire outside the cave, Sue found himself thinking of his band. By now, they would have moved to the summer hunting grounds in the higher mountains. Did they believe him dead? Or had they simply accepted his absence as another step in his solitary path? He had never intended to be gone so long. You're quiet tonight, Miriam observed, her face turned toward the fire's warmth. Are you thinking of your people? Her perception startled him. How did you know? She smiled. Your breathing changes. When you think of them, becomes deeper, like you're carrying something heavy. Sue stared at her, amazed once again by how much she perceived without sight. Yes, thinking of my band. Summer camps. Hunting. Do you miss them? She asked softly. He considered the question, surprised to find the answer wasn't simple. Sometimes, but I chose to be alone. After ... He searched for the words. After many fights. They ate in companionable silence, the rabbit tender and flavorful with the wild herbs they had gathered. As the night deepened around them, stars appearing in breathtaking profusion, Miriam began to hum softly a melody Sue had come to recognize as one of her favorites. Suddenly, she stopped, her body tensing. Sue, did you hear that? He had a distant sound, unnatural in the quiet night. Straining his ears, he recognized it. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving with purpose rather than the casual grazing of wild mustangs. Riders coming this way. Inside, he said urgently, dousing the fire with dirt. Quickly. The riders weren't cavalry soldiers, as Sue had feared, but Apache scouts from his own band. They had been tracking game when they spotted the thin wisp of smoke from his fire. Recognizing the location as Sū'ă's retreat, they had approached cautiously. Uncertain if he still lived, the reunion was tense. Key, the lead scout and Sū'ă's cousin, embraced him briefly before his eyes fell on Miriam, who stood uncertainly. In the cave entrance, his hand moved immediately to his knife. What is this? He demanded in Apache, his voice hard. A white woman in your dwelling? Sue stepped between them. She is blind, he explained quickly. A survivor from the wagon. Train. She cannot harm us. Key's eyes narrowed. You have kept the settler woman? For what purpose? Have you taken her as a slave? No, Sue answered sharply. She is. He hesitated, unsure how to define what Miriam had become to him. She is under my protection, the other scouts muttered, among themselves, clearly disturbed by the presence of a settler in their territory, regardless of her condition. One made the sign to ward off bad medicine. Miriam, sensing the tension, though unable to understand the words, stepped forward. Sue, she asked, her voice steady despite her obvious apprehension. Who are these men? He turned to her, speaking in their shared mixture of English and Apache. My people, scouts from my band? Are we in danger? She asked quietly. Before he could answer, Key addressed him again. The chief will want to know of this. 3 moons have passed since the wagon train raid. We thought perhaps you had fallen to the bluecoats. Instead, we find you living with one of them. His tone made clear his disapproval. Sue straightened, meeting his cousin's gaze directly. I will explain to the chief myself. We will come to the summer camp. He seemed surprised. You would bring her among our people? A blind white woman? Yes. Sue's tone brooked no argument. She has learned our ways. She respects our customs. After A tense moment. He nodded reluctantly. Very well. But you take responsibility for her. If the council decides she is a threat, you must abide by their judgment. When the scouts had departed to continue their hunt, promising to report to the chief, Sue explained the situation to Miriam. She listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. Your people may kill me, she stated, not as a question but as a simple fact. I will not allow it, he replied firmly. Miriam's hand found his arm, her touch light but steady. I trust you, she said simply. When do we leave? They departed at dawn the next day, Sue leading his painted stallion with Miriam mounted, somewhat awkwardly on its back. She had never ridden before, and clung nervously to the horse's mane until she found her balance. Sue walked beside them, guiding the horse along game trails, too narrow for riders to travel side by side. What is your village like? Miriam asked as they traveled, curious about the people who had shaped him. Sue considered how to describe it in terms she would understand. Not village like white people. No houses that stay. We move with seasons. Summer camp in high mountains. Cooler. Good hunting. How many people? Maybe 40, 50. 3 bands together for summer. The unexpected tenderness of the gesture brought tears to her eyes. You're very kind, she said softly. When he finished, he pressed something into her hands, a small clay cup filled with water. Miriam drank gratefully, the water tasting sweeter than any she had known. Sue watched her with mixed emotions. Bringing her here violated every instinct of self-preservation he had cultivated over years of solitary existence. Yet seeing her in his space stirred something long forgotten, a sense of human connection he had deliberately severed after Nakin's death. He busied himself preparing a simple meal, dried venison, softened in water, wild onions, and pinyon, nuts collected during previous foraging trips. The familiar routine helped calm his disquiet at having a settler, a blind woman, no less in his private sanctuary. Using a flat stone and a round river rock, he began grinding some of the nuts into a coarse meal. The rhythmic sound drew Miriam's attention. What is that? She asked, her head tilted toward the sound. Sue considered how to answer, then moved to her side, taking her hands and guiding them to the stone grinding tool. He placed the smooth river stone in her palm, then guided her through the motion of crushing the nuts against the larger base stone. Oh, she exclaimed, understanding. You're making food. He guided her fingers to the crushed nuts, letting her feel their texture, and brought a small portion to her lips. She tasted cautiously, then smiled. It's good, she said. Like something I've had before, but different. The simple exchange, teaching, learning, sharing felt strangely intimate in the flickering firelight. Sue withdrew his hands, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he had touched another person with anything other than violence. After they had eaten, an awkward silence fell between them. Miriam sensed his discomfort and sought to bridge it the only way she knew how, through words, even if he understood little of what she said. I was born in Boston, she began, her voice soft in the quiet cave. A city far to the east, by the ocean. Do you know what an ocean is? Of course you don't understand me, but speaking helps me ... feel less lost. She continued, telling him about her childhood, her mother's death, the fever that took her sight when she was 16. She described Boston's cobblestone streets and church bells, the scent of salt air, the press of crowds. As she spoke, her hands moved expressively, occasionally touching her eyes when she mentioned her blindness or pressing against her heart when she spoke of her parents. Sue listened, not comprehending her words, but understanding her need to speak them. There was a musicality to her voice that reminded him of the creek that ran near his childhood village, steady, soothing, alive. When she finally fell silent, exhaustion evident in the droop of her shoulders, he spread his ceremonial blanket on the sleeping platform and guided her to it. She lay down without protest, her unseeing eyes already closing as her head touched the folded hide that served as a pillow. Thank you, she murmured, the words slurring with approaching sleep, for not leaving me. Sue, as her breathing deepened and slowed. In sleep, The worry lines eased from her face, making her appear younger, more vulnerable. A strange protectiveness washed over him, an emotion so long absent he barely recognized it. Moving quietly, he gathered his weapons and settled near the cave entrance. The cavalry would still be searching, and while his dwelling was well hidden, vigilance had kept him alive these many years. He would stand guard while she slept as the night deepened around them. Sŭ'ã's thoughts wandered paths he had long avoided. What would happen when the soldiers gave up their search? He could not keep her here indefinitely, yet the thought of leading her back to the settler towns filled him with inexplicable reluctance. The stone heart hung heavy around his neck, a reminder of all he had lost, all he had become. Yet for the first time in years, he found himself questioning Nakhun's teaching. Was a heart of stone truly a warrior's strength, or had it become a burden, weighing him down, cutting him off from something essential? In the soft glow of the dying fire, Miriam stirred in her sleep, a small smile touching her lips as she dreamed of something pleasant. Watching her, Sŭ'ã felt the first hairline crack form in the stone he had carried for so long. Days passed with surprising ease as Miriam and Sŭ'ã established a tentative routine in the mountain dwelling. Each morning, Sŭ'ã would leave to scout the surrounding area, ensuring no cavalry patrols had ventured this far into Apache territory. Miriam would wake to find fresh water beside her sleeping place, sometimes accompanied by berries or other foraged foods. During these quiet mornings alone, Miriam explored the cave with increasing confidence, mapping its contours in her mind. Her fingers discovered Sŭ'ã's few possessions weapons, kept meticulously clean, tools for crafting arrows and processing hides. Small bundles of herbs hung to dry from the low ceiling. She was careful not to disturb anything, respecting the order he maintained in his sparse home. When Sŭ'ã returned, they would spend hours in a halting exchange of language. It began simply enough, Miriam pointing to objects and naming them in English, Sŭ'ã responding with the Apache word, water, fire, stone, blanket. But soon they ventured into more complex territory. Clay, Miriam said one afternoon, her fingers working a small piece of the damp earth Sŭ'ã had brought from the stream. The fine-grained soil was pleasantly cool between her fingers, malleable and alive with possibility. Bis, Sŭ'ã replied, the word sounding soft and fitting for the substance. Miriam smiled, repeating the word carefully. Bis. She began to shape the clay, her sensitive fingers working it into a crude but recognizable form, a small bird, wings outstretched in flight. She presented it to Sŭ'ã, who took it with gentle hands. Bird, she said. Susk, he offered, studying her creation with surprise. How had she captured the essence of flight without being able to see? Miriam reached for another piece of clay, forming it into a different shape, this time a four-legged animal. Deer, she said. By, Sŭ'ã corrected, making a small adjustment to the figure's shape, elongating the neck slightly. By. Their hands met in the clay, fingers overlapping as he guided her touch to understand the difference. Neither pulled away immediately, the simple contact bridging more than just language. As the days progressed, their vocabulary expanded rapidly. Sŭ'ã, who had never had reason to learn the settler's tongue, found himself surprisingly adept at grasping new words. Miriam, for her part, pronounced the Apache words with careful respect, never rushing or distorting the unfamiliar sounds. One evening, as they sat beside the small fire sharing a meal of rabbit Sŭ'ã had trapped, Miriam felt bold enough to ask a question that had lingered in her mind. Sŭ'ã, she said, carefully pronouncing his name. What does it mean, your name? He was silent so long she thought he hadn't understood. Then, in halting English, arrow, silent. Understanding dawned. Silent arrow, she translated. Because you move without sound? He made a sound of affirmation, then asked hesitantly, Miriam? She smiled, touched that he would ask about her name. It comes from the Bible, a holy book, she explained, knowing he wouldn't understand most of her words, but continuing anyway. Miriam was a prophetess, a woman who led others through the desert. She was the sister of Moses, a great leader. Sue listened to the flow of her words, catching only fragments of meaning, but appreciating the animation in her face as she spoke. There was a brightness to her when she talked of these things, her beliefs, her past. Desert, he repeated. One word he recognized. Miriam ... desert. He gestured around them at their surroundings. Though she couldn't see the movement, she laughed softly, understanding his meaning. Yes, like the Miriam in the Bible, I am in the desert. But she knew where she was going. Her voice faltered. I don't know what happens next. The vulnerability in her admission touched something in Sŭ'ą. On impulse, he reached for her hand, placing something small and smooth in her palm. Miriam's fingers explored the object, a small stone, polished by water until it was perfectly smooth. Beautiful, she said, though she couldn't see it. What is it? Heart, Sue said, the English word feeling strange on his tongue. He touched his chest, then hers. Strong. It was the river stone Nakins had given him so long ago, the stone heart he had carried as a reminder to keep his emotions contained, untouchable. Why he had given it to her, he couldn't fully explain even to himself. Miriam closed her fingers. Around the stone, its coolness warming in her hand. Thank you, she said softly. I will keep it safe. That night, after Miriam had fallen asleep, Sue out at the cave entrance, looking out at the star-filled sky. The absence of the stone from around his neck felt strange a lightness, both liberating and terrifying. For so long, he had defined himself by its weight, its hardness. Without it, who was he? The question lingered as he watched a shooting star trace a brilliant path across the heavens. Nakins had taught him that such stars were the spirits of great warriors returning to the sky world. Perhaps the old man was watching now, puzzled by his protégé's actions. Inside the cave, Miriam stirred in her sleep, murmuring something too soft to catch. Sue glanced back at her, this strange woman who had somehow crossed the boundaries he had so carefully maintained. She had no idea who he truly was, how many of her people had died by his hand, the reputation he carried among both Apache and settler. He paused, then added, My band's smallest now. Many died in wars. Many took reservation. Miriam absorbed this information thoughtfully. And you? Why didn't you go to the reservation? His voice hardened. Reservation is slow death. No freedom. Bad food. Sickness. White man's rules. He paused, then added more softly, Better to die fighting than live kneeling. They traveled for 2 days, climbing steadily into the mountains. Sue grew increasingly tense as they approached the summer camp, aware of the risk he was taking by bringing Miriam among his people. The Apache had suffered greatly at the hands of settlers and the U.S. Army. Many had lost family members to violence or disease. They had every reason to hate all white people, regardless of individual circumstances. Yet something in him rebelled at the thought of leaving Miriam behind or returning her to settler society. Over the weeks they had spent together, she had become necessary to him in a way he didn't fully understand and wasn't ready to name. Late on the second day, they smelled wood smoke on the breeze. Sue Miriam's knee to get her attention. We are close, he said quietly. Camp ahead. He felt her tense, but was impressed by her composure. What should I do? She asked. Stay close. Do not speak unless spoken to. Follow my lead. As they crested a small ridge, the Apache summer camp came into view below them. Wikiup's dome-shaped dwellings made of brush and hides were arranged in a rough circle in a meadow surrounded by pine forest. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and children played among the structures while women worked at various tasks. Warriors stood guard at the perimeter, alert for any threat to their temporary home. Word of their approach had clearly preceded them. As they descended into the camp, activity ceased. People turned to stare at the extraordinary sight of Sŭ'ą, the lone wolf warrior leading a white woman on horseback into their midst. Sŭ'ă kept his expression impassive, his hand resting lightly on Miriam's leg to reassure her as whispers spread through the gathering crowd. Children were hurriedly pulled aside. and warriors moved subtly to place themselves between the stranger and their families. At the center of the camp, a group of men sat in council around a larger fire. At their head was Nantai, the aging war chief who had led their band through decades of conflict. His deeply lined face revealed nothing as Sŭ'ã approached and helped Miriam dismount. "So," the chief said in Apache, his voice carrying in the sudden silence, "the ghost walker returns and brings a ghost of his own." 3 days had passed since their arrival at the Apache camp. Against all expectations, Miriam had not been harmed or expelled. After Sŭ'ã's impassioned explanation to the council, describing how she had offered him water when she had little, how she had chosen not to alert the cavalry patrol, how she had learned their ways with respect, the elders had reluctantly agreed to allow her to remain temporarily. It was Nalinta, an elderly medicine woman, who had tipped the balance in their favor. After studying Miriam with shrewd eyes, she had declared, "This one's spirit walks differently. Her eyes see nothing, but her heart sees much. Let her stay. I will watch her." Now Miriam sat outside Nalinta's wickiup, her fingers nimbly weaving a small basket under the old woman's guidance. Despite the language barrier, the two had developed a rapport through the shared language of handcraft. Nalinta would place Miriam's fingers in the correct position, make sounds of approval or correction, and occasionally used a few English words she had learned from traders over the years. "Good hands," the medicine woman said now, inspecting Miriam's work. "Quick learn." Miriam smiled in the direction of the voice. "Thank you. You're a patient teacher." Nearby, children played a game involving tossed stones, their initial fear of the blind white woman having given way to curiosity. Occasionally, one would approach to touch her hair or dress before darting away with nervous giggles. Sŭ'ã watched from across the camp where he sat with the warriors, mending hunting gear. He had been reintegrated into tribal life with a mixture of respect and wariness. His prowess as a warrior was unquestioned, but his connection to Miriam raised doubts about his judgment. Key approached, dropping to a crouch beside him. "The scouts have returned," he said quietly in Apache. "They bring news." Sŭ'ã set aside the bowstring he was replacing. "What news?" "Bluecoats. A large patrol moving along the western ridge. More than 20 men, heavily armed." Tension rippled through Sŭ'ã's body. "Searching for us?" "No. They carry this." Key unfolded a paper he had taken from his pouch, a military map, clearly stolen from a cavalryman's saddlebag. It showed the mountains with areas circled in red ink, including their current location. Handwritten notes marked Apache territory and scheduled for pacification. Sŭ'ã's jaw tightened as he studied the map. "They plan to attack our summer camps." "Yes, but they do not know we have this map. We have the advantage of surprise. For now." Sŭ'ã glanced toward Miriam, still sitting peacefully with Nalinta. "We should move camp immediately. Find a more defensible position." Key followed his gaze. "Some say she is the reason they come, that she has somehow signaled them." "Impossible," Sŭ'ã snapped. "She has been with me constantly, and she is blind. How could she signal anyone?" "I know this," Key conceded, "but others whisper. They say a white woman brings bad medicine, even if she means no harm." Sŭ'ã rose, his decision made. "We will take this to the council." By nightfall, the entire camp knew of the cavalry threat. The council of elders and warriors had debated fiercely, their voices carrying through the thin walls of the chief's wickiup where they had gathered. Some advocated immediate attack, striking the soldiers before they could organize. Others argued for retreat deeper into the mountains where the cavalry horses would struggle to follow. Miriam sat with Nalinta outside the council meeting, tension evident in the set of her shoulders. She understood enough fragments of conversation to grasp the danger. When Sŭ'ã finally emerged, his face was grim. He came directly to her, kneeling so they were at eye level, though she couldn't see him. "Soldiers come," he said in English. "Many, with guns." Miriam reached for his hand, finding it with unerring accuracy. "Because of me?" "No," he said firmly. "Not you. They come to take land. Always they come. What will your people do? Council divided. Some want fight. Some want hide deeper in mountains. He hesitated. Chief asks what you know of these soldiers. Their plans. Miriam shook her head. Nothing specific, but I know how they operate. My father, he had friends among the military officers in Santa Fe. They discussed their strategies openly at dinner. Sue was silent, weighing her words. You would tell us? Help against your own people? Her fingers tightened around his. My people killed my father for trying to protect the innocent. They abandoned women and children in the desert. They hunt those whose only crime is defending their homeland. Her voice grew stronger. The Apache have shown me more humanity than those soldiers ever did. He studied her face, moved by her conviction. Come, tell council. Inside the chief's wickiup, Miriam faced the skeptical tribal leaders. Through Sue's translation, she explained what she knew of cavalry tactics, their reliance on supply lines, their vulnerability in narrow passes, their tendency to attack at dawn when they believed the Apache would be sleeping out. As she spoke, the initial hostility gradually shifted to grudging attention. These were not revelations. The Apache had fought bluecoats for years, but her insider perspective confirmed their observations and added valuable context. There is something else, she added. I could approach them. As a survivor of the wagon train attack, they would welcome me, question me. I could mislead them, send them in the wrong direction while your people moved to safety. A shocked silence followed her offer. Sue, translating, found himself gripping his knife, hilt so tightly his knuckles whitened. The thought of Miriam placing herself in such danger made his blood run cold. Chief, Nantai studied her carefully before responding. She has courage, he said in Apache, but this plan would put her at great risk, and there is no guarantee the soldiers would believe her or change their course. I forbid it, Sue said sharply, forgetting his place in the hierarchy. She would be at their mercy, a blind woman alone. Nantai raised an eyebrow at the outburst but nodded. For once, we agree, Ghost Walker. Her offer is brave but foolish, he addressed the council. We will move camp at first light, head north to the high valleys, send scouts to track the cavalry's movements. As they left the council, Sue pulled Miriam aside, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Never offer yourself as bait again. Never. Miriam touched his face, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw. I only wanted to help. These people have accepted me when they had every reason not to. Promise me, he insisted. I promise, she said softly. But Sue, this won't end with one avoided battle. The soldiers will keep coming. You know this. He had no answer for that truth. Instead, he covered her hand with his own, holding it against his cheek for a moment before, stepping back, uncomfortable with his own vulnerability. That night, as the camp prepared for evacuation at dawn, a scout slipped in with fresh news. The cavalry had changed course, moving with unexpected speed along the eastern ridge. They would intercept the tribe's planned escape route. The fragile peace Miriam had found among the Apache was about to shatter. Dawn painted the eastern sky with streaks of crimson as the Apache camp dissolved into quiet, efficient activity. Wickiups were dismantled, essential possessions bundled onto travois, pulled by the few horses the band possessed. Women packed food supplies, while warriors prepared weapons. Children were hushed, their usual morning exuberance subdued by the palpable tension. Miriam stood beside Nalinta's half-dismantled dwelling, feeling oddly useless. Her fingers worried the small silver locket that hung around her neck. Her mother's final gift, containing a tiny portrait she could no longer see but remembered with perfect clarity. You troubled, Nalinta observed in her broken English, pausing in her packing. Yes, Miriam admitted. This is happening because of me, because Sue helped me. The old woman made a dismissive sound. Soldiers come anyway, always come. Take, take, take. Her gnarled fingers touched Miriam's hand. Not your fault, Star Eyes. The nickname given to Miriam by the medicine woman because of her pale, unseeing eyes brought a sad smile to her face. In just 3 days, she had found more acceptance, here than in years among her own people, where her blindness had marked her as an object of pity or burden. Sŭ'ą appeared beside them, his approach so silent that Miriam startled when he spoke. "We leave soon. North path blocked. Must go through narrow canyon to west." "Is it safe?" Miriam asked, hearing the concern in his voice. "No choice. I carry supplies for Nalinta." "You ride with Key's wife." "I can walk," Miriam protested. "I shouldn't take a horse needed for children or elders." "No argument," Sŭ'ã said firmly. "Canyon path dangerous. Riders safer than walkers if soldiers come." As he moved away to help others, Nalinta touched Miriam's arm. "He fears for you," the old woman said. "Never seen ghost walker fear before." Miriam's fingers tightened around her mother's locket. The weight of responsibility pressed against her chest. These people were being forced from their summer hunting grounds, risking a dangerous journey because the soldiers believed she was being held captive. If the cavalry knew she was with the Apache willingly, perhaps they would withdraw. The thought crystallized into sudden clarity. There was a way to help the very way Sŭ'ã had forbidden. "Nalinta," she said quietly, "I need your help." An hour later, as the tribe prepared for final departure, Miriam was nowhere to be found. Sŭ'ã, returning from scouting the first part of their escape route, felt ice form in his veins when Key's wife told him the blind woman had disappeared. "She was with the medicine woman," the woman explained, "then went to relieve herself in the bush. When she didn't return, I searched, but she was gone." Sŭ'ã found Nalinta packing the last of her medicinal herbs. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. The old woman met his gaze without flinching. "She goes to save us all." "What have you done?" he hissed, grabbing the medicine woman's arm. "The soldiers will kill her." "No," Nalinta said calmly. "They are her people. They will believe she escaped captivity. How could she even find them? She is blind in unknown territory." Nalinta pointed to a young boy standing nervously nearby. Tarek guided her part way, then returned as instructed. He showed her to the stream that leads to the valley where scouts saw soldiers. Sŭ'ã released the old woman's arm, already calculating how much time had passed, how far Miriam might have gotten. "Which direction?" he snapped at the boy. "Southeast," the child answered, pointing. "The white woman said to tell you not to follow. She said to tell you that sometimes the greatest warrior knows when not to fight." Fury and fear battled within Sŭ'ã's chest. Without another word, he grabbed his rifle and knife and sprinted toward the stream path. Ignoring the shouts of the chief behind him, Miriam moved slowly along the stream bank, using her walking stick to feel the path ahead. Young Tarek had been a good guide, describing the route clearly before leaving her as she had insisted. "Follow the water sound," he had said. "Always down. Soldiers in Big Meadow, where stream gets wider." She had been walking for perhaps an hour, the morning sun warming her face as it rose higher. Her heart pounded with fear and determination. The silver locket bounced against her chest with each step, a reminder of all she had lost and all she stood to lose now. What she was attempting was dangerous, perhaps foolish, but it was the only way she could think to help the people who had shown her kindness when her own kind had abandoned her. If she could convince the cavalry that she had been a captive who escaped, they might cease the pursuit of the Apache band. If she could somehow persuade them that not all Apache were enemies. A snapping twig stopped her mid-step. She froze, head tilted to catch any sound. "Hello?" she called cautiously. "Is someone there?" Silence answered her, but she sensed a presence, something large moving stealthily through the brush to her right. Not human, the movement was too fluid, too predatory. A mountain lion, perhaps, or a bear. Fear crawled up her spine as she realized her vulnerability. She had no weapon, no means of defense. Slowly she began to back away, her walking stick extended before her. A low growl confirmed her worst fears. Something large was stalking her, and she had wandered into its territory. Panic threatened to overwhelm her as she calculated her options, none of them good. She couldn't outrun a predator, couldn't fight it, couldn't see to avoid it. Help, she called, knowing it was futile. Someone help me. The animal growled again, closer now. Miriam backed against a tree, her walking stick held before her like a pitiful shield. She thought of Sŭ'ą, of the life they might have had if circumstances had been different. At least her death might mean something the Apache would escape, would survive Dot as the predator tensed to spring. An arrow whistled through the air, followed by the solid thud of impact and a surprised yelp of pain. A second arrow followed immediately, then the sound of a large body thrashing in underbrush before going still. Miriam! Sue's voice, tight with fear and anger. Relief made her knees buckle. Here, she managed to call. I'm here. Moments later, his hands were on her shoulders, checking her for injuries. His breathing ragged from his sprint through the forest. Foolish woman, he growled, his voice shaking. Mountain lion almost had you. I'm sorry, she whispered, her composure finally breaking as she grasped the front of his buckskin shirt. I thought I could help. I thought, no thinking, he interrupted. Only dying. Never again, Miriam? Never. Before she could respond, he stiffened, his head turning sharply. Miriam heard it, two voices, the jingling of tack, the heavy footfalls of shod horses. The cavalry patrol was just beyond the next rise. Two. Late to run, Sŭ'ă murmured, pushing Miriam behind him as he knocked another arrow. Stay back. No. She clutched his arm. No more killing. Please, Sŭ'ă. Let me talk to them. Trust me. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him too. Fight or flee. But the approaching soldiers were too many, too well armed, and Miriam's face, turned up toward his, though she couldn't see him, held such determination that he found his resolve wavering. Please, she repeated, I can help end this. Trust me as I have trusted you. In that moment, as hoofbeats grew louder, and the choice more urgent, Sŭ'ă made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Fort Buchanan stood as a blunt statement of American authority in Apache. Territory raw wooden walls surrounding utilitarian buildings, the stars, and stripes hanging limply in the still summer air. Miriam sat in Colonel Harrison Whitlock's office, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face composed despite the tumult of emotions beneath the surface. Let me understand this clearly, Miss Abernathy, the colonel said, his voice containing equal measures of disbelief and condescension. You claimed you weren't a captive, but a guest of these savages? The Apache are not savages, Colonel, Miriam replied evenly. They treated me with dignity and respect after I was left to die in the desert by my own people. Left to die? The rescue parties searched for weeks after the massacre. We found the other survivors, Mrs. Johnson and her children. They reported you had wandered off alone. Because I would slow them down, Miriam said, a hint of bitterness coloring her words. A blind woman was a burden they couldn't afford. The colonel sighed, and Miriam heard the creak of his chair as he leaned back. Miss Abernathy, I understand you've endured a terrible ordeal. It's not uncommon for captives to develop confused loyalties. Stockholm Syndrome. I believe it's called, interrupted Lieutenant Foster, the young officer who had discovered Miriam and Sŭ'ă by the stream. I've read accounts of it in the Eastern papers. I am not confused, Lieutenant, Miriam said firmly. Nor am I delusional, Colonel. I know precisely what happened. The man you call Silent Arrow could have left me to die. Instead, he showed me kindness when my own kind abandoned me. Kindness? Colonel Whitlock's tone hardened. This is the same Apache who led the raid that killed your father and 26 other settlers. The same warrior responsible for dozens of attacks across the territory. He's left a trail of blood from here to the Mexican border. Miriam's composure faltered slightly, though she had come to terms with her father's death. Hearing it stated so baldly stung. War makes monsters of good men on both sides, Colonel. I do not excuse what he has done, but neither will I condemn him for defending his homeland. Defending his, the colonel broke off, clearly struggling to maintain his professional demeanor. Miss Abernathy, this fort exists to protect American citizens from murderous raids. The Apache have a choice: come peacefully to the reservation, where they'll be fed and housed, or continue this pointless resistance and be treated as hostiles. Fed, rancid meat, and housed in squalor, you mean, Miriam countered. I've heard the stories from those who've seen the reservations. People dying of disease and despair. An uncomfortable silence followed her words. Finally, Lieutenant Foster spoke. What exactly are you asking of us, Miss Abernathy? We've rescued you. We'll arrange transport back to civilization once you've recovered from your ordeal. I'm asking you to negotiate rather than exterminate, Miriam said. The band I lived with wants peace, but on terms that allow them to keep their dignity and their traditional lands. Colonel Whitlock laughed without humor. Negotiate? With Apache? The Army doesn't negotiate with hostiles, Miss Abernathy. Then you'll continue to lose men, she said quietly. The Apache know these mountains better than your cavalry ever will. This conflict could drag on for years, costing countless lives on both sides. Before the colonel could respond, a commotion erupted outside his office shouts. The sound of running feet, the metallic click of rifles being readied. Sir, a sergeant burst through the door without knocking. Apache warrior at the gate. Came, out of nowhere, old as brass. What? The colonel rose to his feet. Just one? Yes, sir. Says he wants to speak with you and the blind woman. Miriam's heart stuttered in her chest. Sue, she whispered, you promised to wait in the hills. Sue? Silent Arrow? Colonel Whitlock's voice was incredulous. The ghost walker himself is at my gate? Don't harm him, Miriam pleaded, rising unsteadily. He's come under a flag of truce. How do you know that? Lieutenant Foster asked. Because he would never risk capture otherwise, she replied. Please, Colonel, this may be your only chance to speak with someone the Apache trust. Colonel Whitlock was silent for a long moment, calculation evident in his tone when he finally spoke. Sergeant, have the men stand down but remain alert. Bring the Apache to the meeting room. Double guard. No unnecessary provocation. 20 minutes later, Miriam sat beside Sue at a long table in the fort's meeting room, acutely aware of the armed soldiers lining the walls. The air was thick with tension and the undisguised hostility directed at the Apache warrior, who sat with regal composure despite being in the heart of enemy territory. You take foolish risks, Ghost Walker, Colonel Whitlock said from across the table. What's to stop me from hanging you right now for the murders of American citizens? Sue remained impassive. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear. He had clearly been practicing in preparation for this moment. You hang me, my people attack fort. Many die. He paused. Or we talk. Find way to end blood. Why should I believe anything you say? The colonel demanded. Because he's here, Miriam interjected. Because he walked unarmed into the stronghold of his enemies to seek peace. What greater proof of sincerity could you ask? Sue, as a hand, found hers beneath the table, a brief squeeze of gratitude for her support. Colonel, Lieutenant Foster said quietly, perhaps we should at least hear what he has to say. Washington has been pressing for resolution to the Apache conflicts. If we could achieve through diplomacy what force has failed to accomplish. Whitlock drummed his fingers on the table, clearly torn between military pragmatism and deep-seated distrust. Very well, he said finally. Speak your piece, Apache, but know that I make no promises. Sue reached into his shirt and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft hide. He placed it on the table and carefully unwrapped it, revealing a beautifully carved pipe made of red stone. Peace pipe, he said simply. From our chief. Talk first. Fight only if talk fails. Colonel Whitlock stared at the ceremonial object, recognition flickering in his eyes. After 20 years on the frontier, even he understood the significance of such a gesture from an Apache chief. What terms does your chief propose? He asked, his tone marginally less hostile as Sue began to outline the Apache proposal designated hunting territories. Mutual non-aggression pacts, regulated trade. Miriam felt a glimmer of hope. They were talking. It wasn't peace yet, but it was a beginning. Then the door slammed open, and Major William Blackwood strode in, his face contorted with rage. "What is the meaning of this farce, Colonel? That savage murdered my brother at Apache Pass." The fragile moment shattered. Like glass, Major Blackwood's interruption sparked a chain of events that unraveled with devastating speed. Despite Colonel Whitlock's orders to stand down, the Major had secretly dispatched a cavalry unit to attack the Apache summer camp. Convinced the peace negotiations were merely a diversion, dawn broke blood-red over the mountains as 30 cavalrymen descended on the Apache encampment. Though the tribe had relocated after Miriam's departure, Blackwood's scouts had tracked them to their new position. The attack came as women prepared morning meals and children still slept, a deliberate strike when warriors would be at their most vulnerable at Fort Buchanan. The first indication of betrayal came when a breathless scout burst into the colonel's office, where tense negotiations had continued through the night. "Sir, Major Blackwood's unit engaged the Apache band at sunrise. They report heavy resistance." Colonel Whitlock's face drained of color. "I gave no such order," he said, turning to Sue and Miriam. This was not sanctioned. Sue was already on his feet, fury and fear battling for dominance in his expression. "You speak peace with forked tongue," he snarled, reverting to Apache phrases in his anger. "While women and children die." "I swear to you, I knew nothing of this," the colonel insisted. Blackwood acted against direct orders. Miriam rose, her hand finding Sue's arm. "We have to stop this," she pleaded. "Now, before more blood is spilled." What followed was a desperate race against time. Colonel Whitlock, recognizing the catastrophic breach of the nascent peace talks, ordered his fastest riders to deliver a ceasefire command. Sŭ'ą, released from custody on the colonel's authority, rode beside them, pushing his mount to its limits. Miriam insisted on accompanying them despite the danger, riding double with Lieutenant Foster, who had emerged as an unexpected ally. "I can help," she had argued. "They know me, trust me." The scene that greeted them at the Apache camp defied their worst fears. Blackwood's men, encountering fiercer resistance than anticipated, had set fire to several wickiups. Warriors fought desperately to protect their families, while women hurried children toward the safety of the surrounding forest. A white flag attached to a rifle fashioned hastily from a soldier's undershirt waved ineffectually as Colonel Whitlock's party approached. In the chaos of battle, with gunsmoke obscuring visibility and the roar of weapons drowning all other sounds, the symbol of truce went unnoticed or ignored. Sue leapt from his horse before it had fully stopped, disappearing into the maelstrom with a war cry that chilled the blood of even hardened soldiers. Lieutenant Foster helped Miriam dismount, keeping her beside him as the colonel's men spread out, shouting for Blackwood's unit to stand down. "What's happening?" Miriam demanded, clutching Foster's arm as gunfire crackled around them. "Tell me." "It's chaos," he answered grimly. "The Apache are defending themselves fiercely. Women and children fleeing to the north. Our men trying to establish a ceasefire, but Blackwood's troops are pressing the attack." "Take me closer," she insisted. "Let me help." "Miss Abernathy, it's too dangerous. People are dying because of me," she cried. "Because I tried to broker peace. Please." Against his better judgment, Foster guided her forward, staying close to the colonel's men, who are now physically interposing themselves between Blackwood soldiers and the Apache warriors. In the heart of the battle, Sue fought with the Sŭ'ą, controlled fury that had made him legendary. 2 cavalrymen fell to his knife before he reached Nalinta's wickiup, where the old medicine woman was struggling to help a wounded child. He lifted them both, carrying them toward the tree line, where others had found refuge. Across the clearing, Major Blackwood spotted him. "There, the ghost walker. Take him down." 3 soldiers turned, raising their rifles. Sue, burdened with his precious cargo, had no hope of outrunning their bullets. He set down Nalinta and the child, pushing them toward safety, then turned to face his executioners with the calm acceptance of a warrior who had always known his end would come in battle. The soldiers fired, but their bullets never found their mark. At the last possible moment, Lieutenant Foster had tackled, one man while Colonel Whitlock knocked aside another's rifle. The third shot went wild, splintering a tree trunk inches from Sū's head. "Stand down," Whitlock roared, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "This man is under my protection. The fight is over." A strange hush fell over the battlefield as soldiers on both sides lowered their weapons, confused by the conflicting orders. Into this momentary stillness walked Miriam, her dress torn, her face smudged with ash, but her bearing regal as she moved with uncanny confidence through the smoke and debris. "Enough," she called, her clear voice carrying across the clearing. "Enough death, Apache and soldier alike. We can end this cycle of violence today." Major Blackwood, incensed at seeing his revenge slipping away, broke free from the soldiers restraining him. Miriam's fingers traced the patterns, recognizing their significance. Tears welled in her unseeing eyes, not of sorrow, but of unexpected joy. "Yes," she whispered, "a new path, together." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, two souls from different worlds found common ground in the ancient, healing waters, pioneers of a fragile peace built on understanding, respect, and love.